This is Boom Bust, broadcasting around the world and covering all aspects of our global economy in the 21st century. I'm Daniel Brito.
And I'm Christy I in Washington. Here's a look at what's on deck today. The power of the U.S. dollar has been the dominant player in the financial world for decades. Could that be on the verge of changing? Professor Wolff joins the show today to break down what the future has in store for the greenback around the globe.
Plus, Amazon has come under heat for controversy surrounding facial recognition technology, and now the e-commerce giant is eyeing to create the Rekognition regulations, literally writing them themselves. Author and tech exec Alex Salkever joins the program to give us his view on what's in store for the sector. There's plenty of things on our plate. It's time to get going. Let's go.
With the latest ugly ISM misses, the U.S. equity markets have sold off hard into going to fourth quarter, and they're now testing levels where more technical forced selling will exaggerate the market's volatility. The Dow plunged more than 500 points to break both the 50-day and the 100-day moving averages, with big tech leading the decline. Global markets slumped after the U.S. manufacturing ISM tumbled to more than a decade low, sparking fears that a recession may now be unavoidable as the fallout from the China-U.S. trade war has now spread. Historically, equity returns are the worst when the ISM manufacturing drops from levels below the 50 threshold. What's even more concerning now, though, are the details of the ISM print. New orders, employment, and production, they were all either soft or have deteriorated even further. Only 3 of the 18 industries in the survey reported growth, the lowest figure since 2009. Adding to the bad news, European companies are set for their worst quarterly earnings in 3 years. The latest data lifted the Fed's fund rates futures sharply, with the November contract now pricing in an 80% chance that the Fed will cut interest on October 30th. In monetary terms, it looks like we are at a race to the bottom. The ECB have reintroduced QE at 20 billion euros per month. The RBA cut 25 bips again. The PBOC is now pledging to get rates lower. And meanwhile, the Fed remains a laggard in this entire rate cycle. There are funding stresses in the repo market that are not going away, and now we have just witnessed Vision Fund literally detonating overnight, destroying confidence in all similar VC ventures. And capital and liquidity are now scarce and getting scarcer. We are now in the quad witching hour with the NASDAQ below the 100-day moving average, the Dow below the 100-day, the S&P below the 100-day, and finally the Russell 2000 below the 200.
There is news on a relatively neglected front of the Trump administration's global trade conflict with both allies and declared adversaries today. The U.S. has won a round in the World Trade Organization's arbitration system in the latest episode of a long-running case over European subsidies to Airbus and analogous U.S. support for the Boeing company. In their latest ruling on the 15-year-old case, the panel of 3 corporate lawyers deciding the case found that officially subsidized loans for Airbus caused harm to U.S. competitors valued at $7.5 billion annually, and granted permission to the United States to retaliate with tariffs on $7.5 billion worth of European imports. Financial services are specifically exempted from coverage in the U.S. tariff permit. A countervailing decision on what European policymakers can do to punish the U.S. for their corresponding de facto subsidies for Boeing is expected early next year. Airbus stock fell more than 1% on today's news.
With more on the macro headwinds facing our global economy, we bring back Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So, Professor, the market is now reacting hard to the bad ISM print, and as historically, there has been a very strong correlation between the PMIs, the ISMs, and then the equities market. The services sector, however, is what's been holding up the entire market right now, and all eyes will be on the services reading tomorrow. The gap between the services and the manufacturing number has never been further apart. So, will manufacturing start to drag down services, or can services remain intact?
I think I would bet on the pulling down effect of manufacturing on services. And the reason goes back, if you like, a little bit historically. This is an economic system that's very unstable. Every 4 to 7 years, wherever capitalism has existed, it has an economic downturn. We are now 8, 9, even 10 last real bad crash back in 2008 and 9. We are due for one. Everybody knows it. It would have been bad and probably come a little bit earlier, but having pushed it off, postponed it, mostly because Mr. Trump doesn't want to run for re-election on a bad economy and keeps telling us how good it is, we've postponed it. And now that the chickens are coming home to roost, this is going to be a bad one, and whichever sector goes first, it's this accumulated historical over unprecedented debt, a globalized economy that is now being ripped apart by this U.S.-China fight. These are all signs that we're in for a very rough ride.
And Professor Wolff, the U.S. dollar is now at a fresh 2-year high, but right now Russia is among the actors rapidly reducing their holdings of U.S. dollars and switching to other currencies in trade contracts, or also notably stocking up on gold. What other countries are doing this, and what does this mean for the U.S. and the future of the dollar as the world's reserve currency?
I think what we have to understand is that up until recently, central banks around the world accumulated the dollar as a reserve currency because they thought the conditions of the next 10, 20 years would be more or less like they were in the last 10 or 20. That's what people do. They project. What is happening now is that all projections are being thrown out the window because of this aggressive attack by the Trump administration, first on Canada and Mexico, which at least the Democrats opposed, then on the immigrants, which at least the Democrats opposed, but finally on China, where the Democrats are frighteningly silent. We now see that the world knows that all bets are off where this will go, and so everybody is recalibrating what they should hold. And since they had so many dollars before, many of them, not just Russia, many countries are in the process of downloading, reducing their dependence on the dollar, and the long-term effects of that are almost anybody's guess, but they're not good.
Right, and Professor Wolff, one other sort of fundamental consequence of the dollar being high, high currency, of course, is not a favorable thing in terms of trade, because it makes your exports more expensive in other markets. And so the dollar at a high in the midst of a trade war, what's the potential for the interactions of those factors?
Well, here's the other side of that same coin. When the dollar is high, it's cheap for American companies to buy foreign companies, which they've been doing. If the dollar falls, it becomes cheaper for others to buy American industries and coordinate a control abroad. So before we get too excited about bringing down the value of the dollar, remember that it will increase the power of foreign countries and foreign corporations who are already strong in the American economy to become stronger. It's a situation in which whichever way the dollar goes, it cuts both ways, and we're going to have to see how that plays out before we can say what the balance will be.
So now the Fed they're starting to continue their repo operations this week. And while the drop in total repo assets used was certainly an improvement from last week's numbers, the continued demand for reserves now suggests that this funding shortage is anything but a calendar event like what they said it was or claimed it was. So doesn't this confirm that there is now an acute shortage in reserves?
Yes, and it confirms that there are more structural, more basic reasons for that aberration over the last couple of weeks in the repo markets. It suggests that the same underlying forces crushing the manufacturing, worsening international trade, are also squeezing liquidity. More and more companies are very worried about whether the people they do business with are going to go bankrupt. The other companies, but increasingly the over-indebted consumer. We are looking at a very serious economic crunch, and we're not being helped by a government that keeps telling us we have the greatest economy in the world, which distracts us from the fundamental problems this economy has.
And Professor Wolff, finally, very quickly, we noted that the White House has proposed, the president has at least proposed, placing capital restrictions on U.S. capital flows to China. Is that at all even feasible, much less preferable?
Well, in the past, I would have said, I don't think so. But this is a government that's getting more and more desperate about its re-election, more and more aware that what it's done so far is causing as many griefs for them as advantages. So I'm beginning to wonder, as is the world. You know, it doesn't matter that I wonder, but bankers around the world, governments around the world, the United States is becoming what it used to call other countries, namely, economically at least, a rogue state, someone you can't predict, doing wild things that have repercussions that the people doing this don't seem to care about or to understand.
Interesting times when the global hegemon goes rogue.
Yes.
Richard Wolff, host of Economic Update. Thanks so much for your insight.
Thank you.
There is more drama around the German role in settling the ECB monetary policy this week. The head of the German central bank is warning its colleagues at the European Central Bank against modifying the current limits on the ECB's renewed bond buying program, formerly known as QE. In an understated but clear language, the Bundesbank president Jens Wildman told the audience of Vienna, said, "The accuracy and importance of the limits set by the Governing Council on the government bond purchases have not changed. I hope that the decisions now taken don't lead to these restrictions being questioned." Mr. Wildman's comments seem to be aimed at the preemptive concerns of some expert observers who say that the ECB is likely to hit limits on purchases before inflation hits their target of 2%. The ECB policymakers have said that they would not halt the bond purchases until the Eurozone's inflation reaches that level.
Time now for a quick break, but stay tuned because when we return, Amazon has come under heat for controversy around facial recognition technology, and now the e-commerce giant is proposing to write their own regulations for their own program. Literally. Author and tech exec Alex Salkever joins the program to give us his view on what's in store for this sector. And as we go to break, here are those market numbers on a wild day at the close.
There's something for you on your Sports HQ.
I'm Holland Cook. I invite you to climb with me above the mainstream media mire, and from that higher vantage to glimpse the big picture. Question more.
RT America brings you stories of worldwide significance, news the corporate media refuses to show you. From social movements to civil wars to tech breakthroughs to epidemics, because our journalists and audience alike dare to question more.
Welcome back. There is more legal intrigue in the banking sector to report today as a former currencies trader at Citigroup sues the global megabank for $112 million. The former head of Citigroup's European currency trading desk in London, Rohan Ramchandani, alleged that in the wake of a 2013 rate-fixing scandal in that market, Citi unfairly singled him out for suspicion in an effort to create a scapegoat. Plaintiffs' lawyers wrote in the suit, quote, Citi quite literally fabricated an antitrust case for the DOJ against Ramchandani based upon knowingly false allegations that he engaged in market manipulation and collusion. Mr. Ramchandani and two alleged accomplices in the alleged rate fixing were quickly acquitted at trial, while Citigroup eventually settled the rate fixing case with payment of $2 billion in fines to authorities in the U.S. and the U.K.
France is now the latest country to start cracking down on short sellers as the country reacts to a growing wave of activist investors who are targeting some of its best-known companies. Carsten Block, who is the world's most feared short seller, now turned his 10-year reign of terror from China to France. Block's hedge fund Muddy Waters has launched bear attacks on France's hottest stocks, including retailer Casino Gauchard Perrachon, IT firm Solution 30, and Rally SA, sinking those share prices down over 30%. Now, government commissioners have published recommendations aimed to prevent short sellers and activists from what they call destabilizing French corporates. These have included widening the disclosures of short positions to derivative instruments, pushing for more transparency around the borrowing and lending of the stock, and investigating whether market functions are jeopardized once short selling reaches a certain volume of shares. So there has always been a controversy around short selling. However, they play a significant role in the market due to efficient price discovery, increase market liquidity, uncovering fraud and corporate misdeeds, facilitate hedging, and limits upwards market manipulation. A really good example of short selling significance involved identifying the overpriced Enron and then subsequently unraveling their accounting practices.
French President Emmanuel Macron will visit China next month to meet with his Chinese counterpart, President Xi Jinping, for talks on an agenda that includes climate change and trade. This is the French president's second trip to China since taking office in 2017. RT's Charlotte Jabinski in Paris has the story on this upcoming diplomatic journey.
Well, it's been confirmed President Macron is to make a second official visit to China later next month in the hopes of deepening trade between his country and China, and also to try and deepen relationships when it comes to fighting climate change. Now, this comes at a time when there is an escalating resistance from EU leaders and also from businesses to do trade with China over what many have seen as China's reluctance to change its practices over what many say are unfair issues such as currency manipulation, which also has been a criticism from the United States. Now, this visit will be seen as being very important. Of course, China is a huge economy and a big trading partner for the European Union, so President Macron wants to get ahead of that. He's also hoping that that trade will bring some sort of appeasement to European leaders who at the moment are concerned that Washington could be about to make some retaliatory tax and levies on European products. This is in retaliation for a verdict earlier this year, the World Trade Organization ruling that European governments had illegally subsidized a European company called Airbus. So countries in Europe fearful that their products could soon be whacked on with extra tax and cost much more. Now, the EU is also hoping, President Macron as well, to move closer with China in regards to climate change, while at the same time the US seems to be moving further away. So interesting to see President Macron now making his second visit next month to China, an official visit in the hopes of strengthening the ties when it seems that ties with the United States are only getting weaker. Charlotte Jabinski from Paris for Boom Bust.
The fusing of facial recognition technology with the corporate powers of Amazon empire is causing many privacy advocates to warn that the dystopian visions of the future may be much closer to becoming a real-life Philip K. Dick novel than we think. The U.S.-based global retail giant owned by Jeff Bezos, who also owns the Washington Post newspaper, has developed a facial recognition system known as Rekognition with a K. The company has faced criticism even from Amazon employees over their past attempts to sell Rekognition to interested customers, as well as the police and immigration enforcement regimes that tortures children by separating them from their families. Now, Mr. Bezos, the richest man in human history, has generously offered to advocate the public interest in this debate by writing the very laws that might regulate this unsettling and profoundly risky technology. Joining us now to discuss this issue at the cutting edge of technology and the global business is the author and tech executive Alex Salkever. So, Alex, writing regulations for your very own and very lucrative company is a very interesting predicament right now, and it seems a very bold move for this company facing an antitrust investigation from the DOJ. So what did Mr. Bezos propose this week in Seattle at the annual event to promote their Alexa device, a product that already has privacy issues of their own?
So I think you're correct in saying that this could be a problem. I also want to point out and really unpack this in two ways. First of all, every company in the US that has a serious lobbying arm is interested in writing their own laws. So I don't think Amazon's any different in that regard. And this is to be expected because they want to get ahead of the privacy concerns. They want to get ahead of what people are saying. And ideally, as we've seen with all these tech companies, the way they prefer to deal with any type of controversy is to either make sure that there's voluntary compliance rather than mandatory compliance, or if there are laws being written, that they are way ahead of that curve. Now, to take the second level, though, we should ask a bigger question, which you alluded to, and that's how do we handle a society where literally our face is being captured almost everywhere we go by cameras, by all different companies that want to use that for their own purposes, maybe without telling us how they're going to use it.
Right, and Alex, you started touching on some of the issues involved here, but temporarily setting aside the ethical and security issues presented by Rekognition, there's practical matters. The city of Orlando, Florida canceled their pilot deployment of the technology because, as the Orlando Weekly put it, this capped 15 months of technical lags, bandwidth issues, and uncertainty over whether the controversial face scanning technology actually works. So what are the persistent technical bugs here, aside from the ethical issues, and what is Amazon doing to patch those bugs?
So I think actually everybody is having these kind of bugs when they're trying to run facial recognition at scale. Even in China, which probably has the most advanced facial recognition programs of anyone in the world, and some of their companies over there are actually selling technology back into the US. They struggle when they're trying to do facial recognition that's running in the field in wild conditions without specific bandwidth or without specific ways of making sure that it works. Amazon is also struggling the same way because facial recognition technology as something that's just happening out there is still pretty cutting edge. I mean, don't get me wrong, the algorithms that can do this are everywhere. They're easy to use, they're essentially open source, but at the same time, it's a big difference between making it work in a lab on a limited subset of people versus making it work in the field or on a database that's less structured where maybe the images it's trying to recognize, the faces, are not all perfectly positioned. They're not all perfectly spaced. Maybe someone's wearing a hat or glasses or something like that.
So now turning back to the issues around the collusion of Rekognitions with the systemic racism in U.S. law enforcement, the ACLU of Northern California notably tested the system using headshots of members of Congress with mugshots. So they found a high false match rate of 28 out of 535 members falsely identified as a match, with people of color being disproportionately represented, accounting for 11 among those 28 false matches. So tell us how these technical issues can begin to get tangled in the issues of racial justice as well as general privacy.
So look, this isn't just a facial recognition issue. This is an AI issue, and this touches on the fact that all AI, all machine learning, is built on top of previous data. The only way that machine learning systems can learn is by looking at what we tell it is correct and building off of that. So if all of the previous data, all of the previous systems are biased, which we know they are, then of course you'll start to see racial bias pop up in newer systems. That's not necessarily a fault of facial recognition or AI. That's a fault of us in our inability to create data that's actually clean and not racially biased. And it's going to be a tremendous problem going forward, not just for what you're seeing with facial recognition of politicians or facial recognition of everybody, but all sorts of issues where AI is touching our lives, whether we get credits and bank loans, whether we are awarded jobs, or whether we pass through interview processes, all things like that.
And Alex, you touched on this earlier, but some observers have said, of course, it's understandable that Mr. Bezos would propose self-regulation, since many legacy sectors of today's economy have effectively captured the agencies that are supposed to regulate them. But is that view, perhaps cynical, likely to be vindicated in the end, with Amazon and ultimately winning the privilege of regulating itself in a manner analogous to the way we see, the oil industry influencing the U.S. Interior Department?
Oh, it's absolutely a risk, and I think it's a terrible idea for the companies that are making the technology to write the rules and be given the right to decide how they will be held accountable. I think that should be a much broader discussion. I think the risk here is that the technology is really outrunning the regulations. Right now, you can go and buy Amazon Rekognition as a service with a credit card. You don't have to have any special technical capabilities. They've designed it so that almost any programmer can bake that into the algorithms that they're running. So right now, this is out there, it's being used. And I think that Amazon, of course, wants to regulate it themselves or wants to at least write the laws. But as a society, we really need folks like the ACLU or EFF to weigh in and say, wait a second, how is facial recognition really going to be used? Will we have control of our faces going forward? And it's literally that question. Will we be able to control the use of our face and the data from our face in the way systems interact with us in society?
I think Jeff Bezos is just trying to implement some regulation in a space where there hasn't been any yet, similar in blockchain as well. Author and tech executive Alex Salkever, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
And finally, NASA has selected 14 U.S.-based companies to receive a total of more than $40 million that will fund projects for further exploration of the Moon and Mars. Individual companies will receive grants between $1.3 and $10 million for projects that will work to solve a myriad of issues that affect space travel. The funds come from NASA's Artemis program, which hopes to land humans on the Moon again by 2024. The largest block of funding is going to Amazon founder Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin. That company will focus on cryogenic technology that they hope will eventually lead to being able to produce fuel on the Moon. Elon Musk's SpaceX also received funding as part of the project.
It's ironic because Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and all their companies are actually profitable and they have been making so much money that they don't need funding, versus NASA is a government entity that doesn't even create any profits for their own.
Right. Well, and then Jeff Bezos, of course, famously said, there's really no way for me to spend all the money I have unless I burn it trying to get into space. But I don't know why he needs the grants in that case. In any case.
That's it for this time. You can catch Boom Bust on DirecTV, channel 321, Dish Network, channel 280, or streaming 24/7 on Pluto TV, the free TV app, channel 279.
Or you can always catch us at youtube.com/BoomBustRT. See you next time.